I'm just going to wait for a few minutes so that everyone gets settled. So just feel free to just chill for a few minutes and then we'll get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Again, we're just waiting a few minutes so that everybody is able to log in. Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Neuro Racism Meet the Experts Roundtable discussion. Again, my name is Termara Parker and I am the organizing team member of Black in Neuro and a speaker in this panel today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the lands of the Piscataway and Susquehannock, who are indigenous to these lands. And we are all joining this event from places around the world. So I invite you to take a moment to reflect on the lands that you are joining from, as well as your relationship to those lands and to the indigenous peoples who have and continue to inhabit them. I also acknowledge the lands that I have not been a part of, but I know my ancestors have been a part of in Nigeria, as well as Benin and Togo in Africa. So before I begin, I would just like to thank our conference sponsors by playing this short video. So these are just some of the supporters that we've had in Black and Neuro, but we just would like to acknowledge like a lot of them that have supported us throughout this week. I hope you've been able to enjoy some of our other programming throughout the week, including Black and Neuro Roll Call and Neuro Across the Diaspora. And I hope everyone enjoyed the keynote address by Dr. Flavia Santos yesterday. And if you were unable to attend any of those sessions, check out our YouTube page, where all of our events from today and the rest of Black and Neuro Week are either available now or will be posted shortly. Additionally, if you want to share any highlights from what you've learned today on social media, please do so using the hashtag neuroracism, as well as BIN23. And additionally, we have another hashtag, which is neuroinclusion, in which during the session, I invite people to use the question and answer function during the session to ask panelists questions. And you are also welcome to bring up suggestions on how to make things more inclusive in neuroscience and psychological experiments, and live tweet using the hashtag neuroinclusion. So an example you could talk about, like, for example, in one of our papers, we were talking about including Black hairstylists in our practice. So you can use that hashtag to even suggest that, to say, hey, one way to be inclusive in neuroimaging research is to include Black hairstylists in experimental practices. So feel free to use any three of these hashtags throughout the day. And just keep retweeting a whole bunch of things too. So first, I will just introduce myself and my relations to my other two panelists. So I received my PhD in neuroscience at Yale University and my bachelor's degree in biology from Howard University. And my passion for neuroscience is personal, as I always knew I want to advocate for Black people with neurodevelopmental disorders, like one of my youngest sisters. I was also instrumental in creating resources and opportunities for underrepresented minorities to build community as the graduate director of the Yale BBS Diversity and Inclusion Collective. And I'm currently the grants and contracts administrator at the Lieber Institute for Brain Development. But in addition to being a scientist, I kind of wanted to show, because since we're talking about neuroracism, we have to think about the context of like us being just human beings and how we're, as scientists, we're here to try to help make things better for other people. So this is last weekend. I went to my mom's 60th birthday, and this is just my whole family. And this is the reason why I've been passionate about science and why I decided, oh, I want to make sure that science is even being more inclusive because of one of my sisters who's autistic. And one thing I noticed when I was doing my research, I primarily focused on electroencephalography, EEG, as well as functional near infrared spectroscopy, is that EEG and FNIR systems are not designed to accommodate protective styles and coarse and curly hair common in individuals of African descent. So this is a picture of me trying to put an FNIRS cap. As you can see, it doesn't fit correctly. So it had me think about many questions. How can we see the adverse effects of racial trauma in real life social interactions? And how can we accurately diagnose Black children? And this is just two of many questions that we can talk about. And then even to put it further, I know I gave examples of kind of just personally how like I could see someone like my sister couldn't be a part of these studies, but also just thinking of people like who I love. So even though I'm from Boston, I enjoy listening to Beyonce and Megan Thee Stallion and thinking that these famous people, because of the protective styles and their hair, couldn't be part of the study. That's crazy. So because of this is why I have the panelists I have with me now. First, I had Jocelyn, who was my mentee at Scientific Latino, also my friend that we met at Yale, in which we were talking about as experimentalists, how we see this exclusion of minoritized individuals, whether they be Black, whether they be brown or just disabled, and kind of this overrepresentation of white participants in neuroimaging research. So to first introduce the first panelist, so Jocelyn Ricard, she holds a bachelor's degree in neuroscience from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, and she is currently working as a research assistant at Yale University and will begin her PhD in neuroscience at Stanford University this fall. So that's exciting. So we are the first authors of the two papers that we suggested for everybody to read. And so this is how we're going to start our discussion. And then our second panelist is Lucina Uddin. And after receiving her PhD in cognitive neuroscience from the psychology department at UCLA in 2006, Dr. Uddin completed her postdoctoral fellowship at the Child Study Center at NYU. And for several years, she worked as a faculty member in psychiatry and behavioral science at the Stanford School of Medicine. She recently joined the psychiatry department at UCLA as a full professor in 2021. And the reason I'm bringing up this paper is because she was the editor of this special edition that we have for Frontiers in Neuroscience. So me, Teresa, and Inja Marie were able to write this paper, she was helping us with the editing process. So I'm thankful to have her as a panelist as well. So this is just kind of a short introduction. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then we're going to kind of dive into some of the questions. So for the first question I want to ask the panelists, I want to ask what got them into neuroimaging research.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm so excited and honored to be discussing this with you all. And I would say for what got me into human subjects research, within neuroscience, I was, really interested in understanding substance use disorders, but also the social, political, environmental impacts that, further perpetuate substance use disorders and a lot of, impacts of psychiatric illness. And so for me, working with people in research was the best way I could think to do that.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Lucina. I'm so glad to be here today, and I'm really impressed by this whole initiative. Everything that's going on with Black and Neuro is just amazing. So I actually got into neuroscience mostly just out of curiosity because I heard the myth that you only use 10% of your brain, and I was like, what? That doesn't really make any sense. And but it sounded like kind of a mystery that, I wanted to get more into as I started studying the brain as an undergrad, and then going into the PhD, I became really interested in neurodevelopmental disorders, including autism spectrum disorder, and started really trying to figure out the brain basis of things like behavioral inflexibility, and trying to figure out, what exactly are the neural mechanisms underlying some of what we see in these conditions. So yeah, I'm really happy to be here and to chat with all of you today.
Yes, yes. And you already kind of heard a bit why I'm interested in it, but I guess to delve more into it. So my sister was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder at age of 9, and since then I'm only 2 years older than her. I had been interested in understanding neurodevelopmental disorders. I did some research at MIT during my summers in undergrad, and that kind of really helped me see that I was interested in doing human research studies. So yes. So the next question is, what neuroimaging tools have you used in your research, and how long have you been using these tools?
For me, I actually started in FNIR's work when I was in undergrad. And I remember when I started using FNIR's, one of the comments that was made to me in my early days was essentially, by the way, this doesn't really work in people with darker skin or coarser hair. And I kept thinking, oh my goodness, like I I cannot continue, I don't see myself working with FNIRS for the long term. And so I thought, well, MRI would be like a wonderful segue to jump into. And so in my current research assistant position, I've been using MRI for the last 2 years.
Awesome. Yes.
So for techniques, I was kind of clueless as a grad student, so I just kind of wanted to learn them all. So we started, and so yeah, I started working with EEG, found out that was difficult. I didn't want to continue so much with that. Had some experience with transcranial magnetic stimulation, which lets you sort of target the brain and do what's called virtual lesions to look at if you disrupt activity in a brain area, how does that disrupt function? So I did that for a little while as a PhD student, and really finally got started with functional MRI towards the end, and found that to be the technique that I think is easiest to apply in some ways, even though there's still subjects that are definitely excluded by it.
Mhm.
So now, yeah, I've been working in fMRI research for the past 20 years.
Awesome. Awesome. And then I know a common question that I think Jocelyn and I have probably heard is like, what has led us to write these papers? And I can kind of just start like how we even talked about it, and I can just let Jocelyn finish it. So because she came in as a research assistant at Yale, we ended up actually just talking in a happy hour and talking about the problems that we've seen in our research. She said she started doing FNIRS research. I did EEG research the first half. I'm in the second half, I was doing FNIRS research. And I just realized that I was like, I just never see people that look like me. And when people that do look like me, they're kind of encouraged to either straighten their hair or to take their protective styles out. So because of that, we're deciding like, hey, like this is actually a big problem. Like we should actually just write about it. I mean, that's the big thing that we know as scientists, like publishing is a big thing. So that's kind of like why we started. And I'll just let Jocelyn continue.
Yes, though, I couldn't agree more. It was actually in undergrad. I remember thinking, oh my gosh, this cannot be okay. Because it kind of was, common practice. We all, or, a good chunk of people were like, yeah, it just doesn't really work on darker skin or coarser hair. And I was just so taken aback that that was the norm in a sense. But moving to MRI and seeing what different ways in which people were excluded, and especially from communities I cared about. It was, something had to be said. And so, right, like when Termara and I were chatting, it was just it was like the same experiences, but in different labs and, different techniques. And really, it was just something that it was a necessary conversation that we thought would be best to write about.
Yes, yes. And kind of following up on that so that way everyone's on the same page, if we could just talk about, I guess, a brief summary of what was found and reported in the two papers. So I don't know if Jocelyn, if you want to start, or I can start.
Oh, you can start, no worries.
Okay. Yes. So for our first piece, which is like the correspondence, that was more of a call to action, in which we were really trying to talk about, okay, what are the problems that we see, especially in EEG and FNIRS research? We actually did highlight Arnell Eaton in her discovery of the novel EEG electrodes, and also wanted to really just emphasize that we don't want to just burden all of this on our Black researchers to find the answers to the problems and trying to fix the methodological problems that are occurring. And we really wanted to show that it's not just about the researchers, it's also the engineers, also the people that are in charge of grants, to kind of really like make sure, because it's a systematic problem, so it's going to need to have a systematic answer. So everybody needs to be involved in changing that. So that was kind of like our first paper. And then with the second paper, we were definitely being more in depth. We include an MRI in that, we include FNIRS, EEG, in which we were kind of giving a historical lens of like the mistrust of science, of how the community can see scientists, and kind of giving more history of kind of just racism in general in terms of like craniotomy and trying to look at like skull thickness. And then also we talked about all the methodological problems that we see in all three of those technologies. And then in terms of analysis too, which is a big thing when we have these big banks, and these big data banks might only have about like 95% are white people. And we're using that to make analysis and to also predict specific disorders, for example. And then also we actually ended it with, we had some questions, like what are some questions we can do moving forward in the community? How can we make this more inclusive? So this was, the second paper was kind of more giving an action plan of like what we can do moving forward. So yes, and I'll just let Jocelyn kind of fill in some other things.
Yes, totally. I think, as a community, we saw a lot of emphasis on, hiring faculty or within these institutions. But I think, having chatted with Termara and the rest of our team, it was like, it wasn't just the people on the team, but it was also, this process of science that we were losing people. I mean, from the beginning to recruiting people to come into our studies, and then having them there and dealing with the barriers in our technology, but then also too the downstream impacts of the analyses that we conduct as neuroscientists. It was at all of these stages we were seeing different ways in which we were excluding people. And I think science and neuroscience cannot work for a sub part of the population. We need to actively work to making our science generalizable. And when we lose people along this pipeline, we cannot do that.
Mm-hmm. And we also were very active in making sure that we had as many Black authors as we could. So actually everyone is, besides a senior author, is a person of color. We have about 4 Black authors. So we also wanted to make sure that, our voices are being heard too when we're talking about this. And then for this question directed to Lucina, What led you to be the topic editor for Frontier in Neuroscience's Authentic Justice, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion?
Yeah, actually, I work in, I guess, as you can imagine, all of you have this similar issue where you're on every single diversity committee that exists. So I'm on, the local ones for my organization, the society ones for the societies that I'm part of. Like right now, I'm at the Organization for Human Brain Mapping, and I'm the chair of the diversity inclusivity there. And, we just had a panel where we, talked about using technology to enhance diversity in neuroimaging, and where we did actually highlight that work from Jasmine Kwasa and Arnell. So we just had a great presentation there. And I'm also involved in the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, which is a kind of nationwide 21 site consortia looking at brain, looking at brain and behavior across young children. And basically, I got appointed as the Associate Director for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusivity for that entire consortium. So basically, I'm spending, 20 hours a week on like diversity related initiatives on, in these different fronts. And so through some of these things, I've met people working really hard on all the topics that you both have been working very hard on. And one of them is Stephanie Bodison, who basically wanted to do this special issue that you mentioned. So I worked with her to promote the special issue and get authors like yourselves to contribute to it. So basically, I'm kind of just behind the scenes trying to push things forward in any way I can, because I think it's like really important for people once they get into positions of power, like editors of journals, on admissions committees, et cetera, like that. I think it's important to use the power and push things forward. So I'm not shy about if someone says, "Hey, can you put this in the program for the meeting, or can you make sure we get this speaker on the panel so that it's not just a bunch of men?" I try to just kind of use my positions wherever I am to make sure we can promote the people doing the work.
Yes, we definitely need that. Thank you for that. So I kind of want to go a little bit more specific on how can cognitive neuroscience and psychological research mitigate the impact of exclusion and distrust among minoritized populations to ensure diverse and representative study participation. Very loaded question, but I know we talked about it in the paper. So I just wanted to give the opportunity to kind of just talk about what are some ways we can help with this distrust that we see in the community?
One thing that I feel like, we always go back to is representation. And I think having representation on your team and coming into communities with that representation, I think is extremely valuable. I mean, I think we lose the pipeline, especially in our country, is leaky along the way for many reasons. And we lose a lot of brilliant students and people along the way. But I think when we are really actively working to build community and build trust, I think having that representation on your team, and at every stage goes a really long way.
Yeah, we actually just had a panel on medical mistrust in science for the ABCD project, where we had a few different speakers on this topic. And like you've all explained really well in your papers, like it's hundreds of years of mistrust. You're not going to just overcome it overnight, right? It's not like a quick solution for any of these things. And so, we talk a lot about community engagement to get, participants aware of what's going on with the science, how it might benefit them. Basically the more we don't have participants from minoritized groups, the less useful the medical results will be, right? If we don't know how well they work across populations, we'll never be able to make progress in that sense. But so I also kind of try to advocate on a lot of different dimensions, like we talked about the pipeline, right? So, how do we stop losing people at every step of the way, or pushing people out at every step of the way? So some of what I've worked on is to Think about guidelines like for graduate admissions, for example, or tenure and promotion, the kind of like ways we gatekeep access to academia. So like something I wrote with a colleague a while back is about thinking about evaluation metrics for these various procedures. Like getting rid of the GRE, I think, was one of the best things that many universities did. It was just kind of like a needless obstacle to admissions. We don't need a test that you have to pay for in order to assess whether or not you're going to succeed in grad school. So like things like that. Being on tenure and promotion committees now, just kind of trying to look at what are the criteria we're using. Are we looking only at papers and high impact, grants and things like that? Or are we also looking at mentorship, science communication, open science practices and commitment to diversity, and including that as a criteria for promotion and tenure? So like now, whenever I write a letter for somebody, I actually like call them out if they have made no contributions to any of these other areas. I say like, this person has done XYZ, but they haven't made any substantive contributions to diversity at their institution. They haven't actually, shown evidence of mentoring underrepresented minorities. I've written this in letters now, and I think that's really the way to say like these are the criteria that we think are necessary for the future of science and for the future of scientists who want to make progress in this field. It's not optional to do this work. It's actually part of what you have to do in order to be seen as a prominent and an influential scientist. It's mandatory. So that's kind of some of the stuff I've been doing, just on the sort of like senior end of things. And other stuff that I know you all know about, but there's a lot of really great papers coming out nowadays, and it's hard to keep track. But here is a preprint I think everyone needs to take a look at, which is from a couple authors, Carlos Cardenas Iniguez and Maribel Robledo Gonzalez. And they're talking about how to think about race and ethnicity in, statistically, basically in your research, and ways to do that don't further kind of harm the populations you're trying to study. So a lot of kind of like really careful, nuanced analyses are coming out nowadays. So what I'm trying to do is like basically highlight them, create avenues for people to see them, and make sure they get heard.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for those papers. I hope everybody has those bookmarks so you can read it after this. I think to also add on, I agree with everything that Jocelyn and Lucina said. I think science communication is a big thing too. I think as scientists, sometimes we are just so used to being within our own silos that we'll go ahead and start saying FNIRS, EEG, MRI, and just start saying all these different acronyms and not really taking the time to try to like, how do I explain my research in a way that is like accessible to the public? And also just like explaining the importance of the research. Like the reason we're doing this is because we're trying to understand autism, or we're doing this research because we're trying to understand, the biological mechanisms of how we make decision making. So I think really just talking about things in kind of more accessible terms can be ways for people to realize like, oh, this research is actually pretty interesting, as opposed to just hearing a whole bunch of like technical terms. I think another thing is also when participants come into the studies is to making them feel welcome. No matter if they come in with an afro or a protective style, like participants can feel that. They can feel when they're feeling like, okay, I'm being an inconvenience. When people are not really like, are afraid to touch your hair and getting kind of like nervous. So if they feel that type of energy, they can also, you want to have more participants. You want participants to say, hey, I had a great time when I came here, so they can invite their friends. But if you are coming in and you're feeling like nervous, you're feeling like you're inconvenienced, then that's even like further emphasizing this kind of like mistrust you have of scientists, or even that particular group, and how you're not going to necessarily like advocate like, oh, we actually need more participants. And even like telling participants like where the data is going. So that way they have an idea like, hey, and also even emphasizing that, they are allowed to leave at any point too. Just really just letting them know that it's under their control and not necessarily like, oh, we're just like, testing them and they can't do anything. So yeah, and I think we actually have a question in the audience. This person says, thanks so much for your time and for the papers. One thing I worry about is that many arguments promoting much needed inclusion I see in the wild rely on arguments that, however inadvertently promote racial science understandings. In your opinions, what are some arguments we should or should not use in order to avoid falling into that trap?
Oh, interesting. I guess I'm trying to understand racial science understandings. Does that refer to kind of like the thinking about like deterministic, differences between races, like biological determinism, that kind of?
That's how I'm interpreting it. But that person is here to clarify.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly actually what this paper from Carlos and Maribel talk about, which is that whenever you might see a headline or some kind of neuroscience paper that says like Black individuals show this brain difference, right? Like, so, there's many ways of interpreting that kind of finding. And so what I think that the paper I just put in the chat really emphasizes is when you talk about racial differences, always prefacing with like, what do we even mean by race? What is race? Where did these racial categories even come from? They're not based on some biology or something like that, right? They're based on social, historical, political things that have changed over the last 50, 100 years. So we're talking about the effects of racism, about race being racialized in a society. We're not talking about the race category itself determines anything. We're talking about having the experience of being in this racial category may be associated with these health disparities in the United States, for example. But I think at the outset, like whoever is writing the paper has to be really skilled and nuanced about like when they use this category of race, what does that mean? What does race mean? Because it's not clear, it's not obvious to the reader, to the lay reader, I guess, where these categories came from in the first place, right? So I think that importance is on these science communication end that we have to like really do a lot of work there.
Yeah, I also agree that I think like putting the social context in is like very important, especially when we're talking about like, we know that racial trauma does affect the brain. Like when we're talking about MRI studies, we know that it affects the amygdala. It can also even affect the prefrontal cortex. So like kind of putting that context of like just having societal trauma, racial trauma, and kind of really explaining what that is and how that can really affect kind of brain activity can be something that's really important to really talk about. And I think even just going into the history, like kind of how we did in the paper too, like explaining the history of, what's been happening to Black people in the United States or in the UK or in other places. But I agree, it is a way that needs to, like, you do have to explain it very well because people can take it the wrong way. But I think if you explain this kind of like social and cultural context, I think it can really help.
Yeah, actually, I think the way I've heard it summed up that makes the most sense to me is we're not talking about racial differences in the brain. We're talking about the effects of racism on the brain or being racialized. So it's not, it's not like Black versus white brains. It's like, so the framing is everything.
Mm-hmm. And these are important, especially like for me, I was doing my research on social interaction, and that is something that's important when you are like talking to somebody who is the same kind of like racial identity as you versus somebody who's not. And those are dynamics that may be important to study. So yeah. Okay, so the next question is, what structural barriers are most critical to be addressed in order to prioritize diverse samples in scientific practice? I know we talked about a little bit, but if there's any like big ones that were like, yes, no, this needs to be addressed.
I guess for one of the ways I think about is, building the trust with the communities. And I think one successful way that I have seen this done is often through things like community-based participatory research. But, with the currency of academia is, papers and grants, and oftentimes the time necessary to and needed to devote to building up, this trust within communities, I think are not often incentivized. And so I think one of the ways in which we can do that as a field and as a community is really working that within the system, incentivizing building trust, incentivizing, because it is a long-term sort of thing that we need to work towards. And I think having that within, as we work towards tenure or, other stages of our careers, I think that is really important.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think because I think a lot of times, the fear is like, well, I'm a research assistant, I'm a graduate student, like I don't have money, I can't change the technology. But I think finding ways for us to really incentivize, as Jocelyn said, like being a part of the community. Some ways is even doing partnerships with, Black hairstyles and barbers, obviously still paying for them because they're not going to do stuff for free. To help if you're like, well, I have EEG and like I'm kind of thinking if I braided the hair this way, this could maybe this might be a way to help. Like I think having those types of relationships is like one way that can be done. So yeah, that's kind of my thought.
Totally agree. And I feel like, what you were saying, it's having, for example, Arnell and designing these, electrodes to better reach the scalp and EEG research. I think that is such a beautiful example of, incorporating people at all stages and levels. And even so, like Termara and I working, I'm a research assistant and Termara a grad student, and, coming together to discuss and see these things, because oftentimes if, you don't have the lived experience and all of a sudden someone does, and they're in these spaces, and I think it's really beautiful what can come out of that.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So we have another question from the audience. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this panel. I worry that research around any type of neurodiversity excludes individuals who fall into those categories. What initiatives are going on right now to include neurodivergent scientists and experiment participants? So that actually is something that, so the paper, which I will also put in the chat, that I did with Teresa, we were talking about kind of critical race theory, and also just focusing on disabilities, especially when we talk about the context of autism spectrum disorder, when there are people who have intellectual disability. And because of some of the reasons we already explained, there's like even more like barriers for them to be involved in research. So we also, when we wrote that paper, that also kind of helped us try to like emphasize for scientists to, number one, like we need to actually report demographic materials, not only in terms of like race and ethnicity, but also intellectual disability. So we have an idea of understanding what is included in these research studies, what are we lacking including, and actually putting that in our limitation section, saying like, hey, we only recruited 2 Black participants and we only recruited 1 person with intellectual disability. And this is the reasons why we think this occurred, and this is our plan moving forward. So that is something that definitely will take a lot of planning with even like NIH to kind of make that more of a mandatory thing. Because kind of as Lucina was saying, like, it can't just be like voluntarily doing this, but making this kind of like mandatory practice when you're writing papers to really talk about the limitations and actually reporting the demographic material, so that way we can help see like, okay, where are we missing? Are we missing a lot of people with intellectual disability? Are we missing a lot of people with this particular disorder? Are we missing certain racial groups? And also both, like realizing there's also intersectionality. A lot of like Black autistic individuals who have intellectual disability are not included in research practices. And these are the people who probably would need kind of the most understanding. So this is like something that like Teresa and I have really talked about. And we definitely do encourage, if you are in the audience, like thinking about these, like go ahead and write a paper, just do it.
Yeah,
Okay.
100%, 100% go ahead and write about it. And also like feel free to get in touch with people. Like I usually help people kind of get their stuff published in different journals just by sending pre-submission inquiries and sort of abusing my power as an editor at various journals. So like feel free to get in touch if you have things that you want, and you don't know where to send them, or you're curious about like what the right audience might be. Yeah, just like having your voices out there has made already a huge difference. You can see it when you go to conferences, people start reporting like, oh, this is the breakdown of my participant groups. We had underrepresentation here, that people are talking about it, and with NIH, they're slow to change, but sometimes they do. For example, it's like mandatory to talk about sex as a biological variable in your grant submissions now. You can't just only study men, right? It's like you have to think about, how does this apply to female participants, or how are we going to study that? And so NIH takes a while to do this, but they make changes. Like I've been pushing for them to include discussions of responsible use of data, so that you basically can and having like more consequences for breaches of the data use agreement. So for example, some people do want to do kind of the science that's Fox News kind of science of like black brains versus white brains, and just kind of throw it out there. But like NIH can clamp down on their data use agreements and their responsible use agreements to kind of catch that before it happens, or to impose kind of consequences for researchers who abuse the data that are out there in ways that are harmful. So yeah, there's a lot of things we can push for.
And this actually segues nicely to another question. So this question says, do you believe that some of the possible differences found and described as race associated are due to misuse of the techniques you discussed? In your research, have you seen inconsistencies with results described by other researchers that do not take into account race associated factors such as hair? It's a very good question. I guess I could say, for like, in terms of my research, looking at FNIRS and EEG, I think with both technologies, with FNIRS, because of the constraint in that you have to have optodes on your scalp, if your hair is thicker, it might be harder to actually get into the scalp. And then also when you go in, there's also because it's using light absorption, if you have melanated skin, that can also change the absorption. So with that, you might have less hemodynamic signal in, let's say, the prefrontal cortex. And that could essentially show like, okay, this individual actually didn't have a lot of activity when they were doing this particular task. And I can see how that could actually like influence how, okay, maybe if you were looking at, like in my case, I wasn't necessarily looking at different races, but if, let's say, I was looking at Black participants and white participants, you might think, okay, well, this Black participant seems to have a lower activity in the right temporal parietal junction as opposed to this white participant. While it could just really be because of the technological constraints of FNIRS, and how like a lot of the participants were coming in probably had coarser, thicker hair. And because of that, we weren't able to have like the best signal. And even with EEG, kind of similar to where you might end up having event-related potential that's like a little bit like a slower latency, or maybe like a lower amplitude in a Black participant and not in a white participant, but it's because like the white participant might have straighter hair, shorter hair, and the Black participant has coarser hair. So that's kind of how I've seen it in my research. And I think it kind of goes along with what we're talking about, why it's important for us to really report what's going on, and in terms of like who are the participants, what are the demographic information. I was the author in a paper with Jasmine Kwasa as well as others, in which we were talking about demographic reporting in FNIRS, and it was about like 98.9% of FNIRS studies in the past few years reported like information about skin tone, information about like hair type, and race, which is terrible that we're not reporting this at all. But to get that information, we can better understand to see, okay, maybe there is like, depending on like skin tone, depending on course thickness, and we can kind of understand like what the data actually is saying. But a lot of this information is left out in studies. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the ways that I see this in particular is within things like predictive modeling. And so when we use MRI data and we are trying to predict, for example, cognitive behaviors or risk for mental health disorders, one of the things that pops out, and a lot of that, we see again when we lose people along this pipeline, is that our predictive models that we're building work well for a subset of the population. And oftentimes, in one paper that came out recently by Lee and colleagues in Science Advances, was that they could predict cognitive abilities for white Americans and not for Black Americans. And it is not that, Black Americans are different in the sense of the Black versus white, but really what we're seeing is that we're losing out on the representation within the MRI studies, and also the effects of racism and not race itself.
Okay, we have another question from Claudia. She says, I administer EEG methods on mothers and have recently worked with Black women with Afro-textured hair. I instantly want to make the participant feel comfortable by assuring them this process is always tedious, and please let me know if you're feeling uncomfortable at all. Do you have advice on language to use to aid in making Black participants not feel like an inconvenience? That's a good question.
Hi, Claudia. I think that putting the emphasis on the technology is a great thing, because it is the technology, it is not the people. And I think that is when you're using that language, saying that it is our limitations in our technology and what we're using is, I think, a great start.
Exactly. I think also never saying to a participant like, oh, I don't know if we're going to have good data on you. Like that also is not good language to use. So I think, as Jocelyn was saying, just kind of emphasizing that the technology is a tedious process. It's the technology, not them. Okay, and then we have another question. So it's so helpful to see so many professionals that look like us. And as a scientist or even clinician, how do you navigate experiences where your community distrusts you for being a part of this current system? Good question.
That's an interesting question, because I mean, in some cases, they actually, are really excited to see you there, because it might be the first time they've seen, someone who looks like them as a researcher, or someone who looks like them as a medical professional. In other cases, yeah, there might be that mistrust, like, oh, okay, you're just part of the problem. So, I mean, I think that's one of those like really hard ones where you have to, kind of dig deep to think about it from the perspective of that individual, right? Like why would they come at you with this mistrust? What's their history of experiences that have led them to the point where they're like, okay, I don't care who you are, what you look like, I just don't trust this system. So I think it's just about kind of like establishing that kind of rapport, however you might do that, by like giving a little bit of information about yourself, maybe a little bit of a background, trying to establish some common link. Maybe you grew up in the same area, or just had some experience that they might be able to relate to. Because I mean, it's really a shame if the mistrust is like so deep that that like it just keeps people away from participating in the research, or from from engaging, because that's what keeps the samples from not being diverse, is that we can't get participants into the study. So I think just like any way of kind of establishing a a trust with individuals by sharing enough about yourself that they might find some link to trust you is probably the way to go.
Yeah, I think relationship building is a big thing, and it just depends on each person. But like, we know this when we go to work that, you have to try to build a relationship for people to feel like they feel comfortable with you. I tend to tell people that I have been in research studies, and yeah, like I have not seen people that look like me. And yes, like I haven't been able to put an EEG cap on my head, but I'm trying to make it so we can try to figure this out. Like, we want to figure out, like, is there ways that we can try to change this? So if you want to help in this change, we'll do it. So I kind of try to just put it in the, like, I understand like the level of mistrust because of the history, and then also just like how it can feel kind of scary being in a research facility that you've never been in. And then even small things like your hair, like I've also talked to participants and they're just like kind of worried about their hair, and kind of reassuring them that like, it's okay, like come as you are, we'll figure it out. Okay, so we have a comment. So I think educating the EEG techs and supportive staff who often administer these tests would be important. I spoke to a leader at my institution about this, and she's a white woman trained initially as an EEG tech, and she told me that it was impossible that EEGs were not properly reading, even though I showed her my source. That's true. I think it is very important, especially the good thing is we have these papers. So, and we know that with scientists, like a lot of it, we go based on data. So that's kind of why like Jocelyn and I did the papers, because we know we could all talk about our experiences and how like, oh, we weren't considered good subjects. But I think people don't hear you unless you actually show data. So that's why it's like important to have these meta-analyses that are showing like, hey, we are not including Black participants. Look, from 2010 to onward, like look how many people we are including. So I think that is like very important. Okay, I'm glad we're having lots of discussions. So I like this. Okay. So I guess another question is going beyond inclusive representation, reporting of skin color and hair type. How can researchers dedicate their work to cross-racial findings or effects of racial trauma or adversity, translate their findings in a way that embraces nuance, heterogeneity, and directly impact on the community they study? Sometimes research will make surface level observations of differences between populations without a deeper investigation of what that means for real people. You can take some time to think about it too.
I actually like thinking about strengths-based approaches and resilience when you talk about research, because there's always this, oh, okay, these minoritized groups have this trauma and it affects this and that and other, and their health is poor and their cognition is poor or whatever. But there's also like this whole field of looking at resilience and basically responses to adversity. They're kind of positive adaptations and things like that. So I like to kind of like show kind of both sides of the research when you're communicating it. It's not just like, oh, look at all this we've suffered and here's all the negative consequences, but like here are the ways that communities have thrived and different, I mean, I like to use this example of there's like a Hispanic health paradox where like you have better health than expected in like Hispanic immigrant communities in a lot of ways, and what are the sort of social and familial factors that contribute to these like positive health outcomes in groups that are you expect them to be like doing worse based on all the SES measures, but they're actually thriving, right? So looking at kind of highlighting that there are like, it's not all downsides, right? There's a lot of strengths to these groups. There's another one called like the bilingual executive function advantage. So people show, and in some of the stuff we've shown, like kids with autism who come from a bilingual home show higher executive function skills than monolingual kids, of the same abilities. So, there's a lot of things that we kind of we tend to focus on, deficits and disparities and like all the downsides, but there's a lot of, I think, really inspiring work that I think should also be highlighted when we're communicating this research.
Yes, I agree. And I think what's so exciting about, being a scientist, being in these positions, I think actively working out how to best do that and how to kind of address these issues. And I think, for example, a couple ways that people do this are, looking at an area's deprivation index or, people's exposure to pollution. And I think this sort of cumulative way to do this, I think will be critical because, not only are we complex, but we all don't live, we don't live in a vacuum. And so I think when you're assessing the impact of these structural institutions and racism on our brain health, I think we need to do it from this complex sort of view.
Yes. All right, so we have about like 4 minutes. So I kind of want to take it home and ask, what would the future of neuroimaging research look like for you?
For me, I would say I want our study teams, I want our participants, I want our faculty, administration, everyone involved in this. I want these spaces to reflect the heterogeneity of our lived experiences in this world. And I think when that does look like that, I hope that's what the future will look like.
Yes. I know for me, like I've said this many times and I'll keep putting it home. I've said this quote in my defense. I said it also at another Black and Neuro talk, like science cannot help society if it doesn't reflect society. So I think making sure that when we are doing our research, that our research looks like the population that we're serving, making sure that, these are not just kind of like quiet recommendations, but these are part of the system. I think if this is a systematic problem, that this needs to be a systematic solution, and that we need to have people who are program officers that are really advocating for this. We need it so that when it's grants, it's like, okay, you need to make sure that you have a neuroethicist that is helping you like figure out, okay, is this research actually like ethical? Is this research being very inclusive? I think in terms of like training the research scientists, as we talked about, research scientists, research assistants, or graduate students that are involved in the research, making sure that they understand like how they can approach a person who's coming into their study, not as just a data point, but as an actual person, how to make sure that they feel comfortable. And I think there was actually a question in the audience about like, do we have any recommendations for annual compliance assessments for people to do institutional training on treating hairstyles? I think that is kind of one thing that can also be implemented too. Like when we're doing our compliance that we do every year with HIPAA, and then also even with kind of just like sexual assault training, like this could be incorporated too. When you're like, if you're doing research on human subjects, like this is how you treat people with certain hairstyles.
Yeah, and I mean, I would just say I agree with all of that. And also the future is you. So all of you are the future of neuroscience and neuroimaging and all of the things we've been talking about. It's in your hands to, to move it forward. So it always feels like, oh, I don't have that much power right now. I'm just a student, or I'm just a postdoc, or I have to wait till I get tenure. But the truth is, like at every stage of your career, you have so much power to, make your voice heard. If you're part of the team that collects data, you can tell the PI what's working, what's not working, what your recommendations are. As a postdoc, you are a mentor to grad students, and you can help, cultivate the inclusivity on your team. And as a faculty member, you get to serve on graduate admissions committees, on editorial boards for journals. You decide who gets to be a speaker at a conference. As you go further along, you make these decisions yourself. So it is all in your hands, and you have more power than you think.
I agree. And just having representation too, like it's just great to kind of just, even having all three of us on the panel talking about this, having everybody kind of asking questions and even telling each other all of our like experiences. it kind of helps us see like, we are not alone in this, even though we're like in our silos. And sometimes we're like, oh, I am the only like person of color, Black person in this research group, but no one's listening to me. But, we're in this panel all together talking about it, and we all are agreeing with kind of the things that have been said. I purposefully like, I got locks 6 months ago, and like, I'm just like constantly wearing my locks because I'm like, you know what, the technology is gonna change for people. So I'm hoping that, for those who are locked up can also be part of FNIR's EEG and MRI studies. So yes. So with that, sorry we couldn't get into every single question, but you could email any of us. You could, either follow us on Twitter. I don't know if everybody just wants to put their like information on the chat so everybody can contact them. But thank you so much for attending this session. And we have another session that's coming in the afternoon that I would love for everybody to attend. And again, you can use the neuroinclusion and BIN 23 and also the neuroracism hashtag. So just look forward to the neuroracism and mental health talk that will be happening later in the afternoon. And that's with AZA and Dr. Flores. Thank you.